Hello everybody. It is August 17th, 2025 here in the United States of America. I'm trying a different camera angle tonight. I think I'd like this a little bit better. Actually attached the webcam to the top of the computer like it's supposed to be, and seems like this works a bit better. Now today's video I would like to talk about the recent meeting between President Donald J. Trump of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. This meeting has been the talk of the town, so to speak, in the geopolitical world. I've seen lots of very, very bad takes from it, some very good takes, and also a lot of confusion about certain aspects of this meeting and why things were done the way they were. Well, first of all, I just want to say that it's very good that this meeting happened. It's very positive for relations between the United States and the Russian Federation that we can have these kinds of meetings on American soil and meet and discuss issues in a very civilized and diplomatic way, especially direct face-to-face between the upper echelons of our respective governments. That bodes very well for our two people, some U.S. citizens and citizens of the Russian Federation. I really don't believe there's actually any real animosity in either country for one or the other as far as people go, but our governments have been at odds over various things. But I think a lot of Americans and most Russians don't wish to see a direct war between the United States and the Russian Federation. I do honestly think it's a war, and then saying this from a fairly objective point of view, that nobody would win. So the more diplomacy we can engage in, the better. There are several questions and concerns and whatnot that people brought up at the meeting, why things were done the way that they are. First of all, why is President Donald J. Trump so chummy with Putin? Why is he so polite to Putin? Why was he so accommodating and welcoming to Vladimir Putin? Well, here's the brutal reality of international relations, especially when it involves relations between peer powers versus powers that are viewed as vassals and absolutely not peers in any way, shape, or form. One of the prime examples that people brought up, contrasting how President Trump treated President Putin, was how President Trump treated President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine several months back at their meeting in the White House, where Trump seemed hostile and angry with them, and President Zelensky seemed indignant and frustrated. Here's the difference. The Russian Federation is a peer nation. It's not reliant on the United States of America for anything. It's one of the great world powers, along with the United States, Russia, and China, which these three countries generally call the shots on what happens in the world today. They're the three guiding countries behind world history. It's it's the United States, it's China, and then it's Russia. It's those three, with India, I think, being quickly coming up to a close fourth place. But those are the three dominant powers in the world today. So when their respective leaders meet each other, there's always going to be decorum and professionalism, or at least they should be, because doing anything other than that could be diplomatic suicide. Other countries get treated like vassals when they are vassals. That's a difficult thing to hear and probably makes people mad, but President Trump doesn't feel the same kind of obligation to be polite and respectful to, say, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, as he would the President of the Russian Federation. Like, he doesn't feel that belittling him to his face is wrong and not something you should do, because again, like, Keir Starmer is not viewed as a peer. Most Western European countries are viewed as vassals of the greater United States empire. That's just an unfortunate reality. These countries don't have on their own really any kind of economic or military leverage that the United States would ever take seriously. They absolutely don't. So oftentimes their leaders are treated as inconsequential, sometimes a nuisance, Trump will be friendly with them, but he won't hesitate to bully them to their faces. But Xi Jinping of China, President Trump, would not even remotely think of ever doing that. Same thing with Vladimir Putin. So there's always going to be a level of decorum and respect between these leaders, and, well, for all of our sakes, there needs to be. I think a lot of people are confused by why Trump didn't call him a war criminal to his face and act openly hostile and dismissive of him. President Putin, who's also a professional, who understands this concept very well. Now, Putin tends to be pretty polite to most world leaders that he meets, but again, he has the same understanding of geopolitics. Is there's a level of decorum between peer countries that needs to be maintained, and if President Putin put himself in a situation where another world leader would openly disrespect him to his face, he would turn around and go home immediately, and that meeting would have been over, and no fruits would come of it. No world leader in his position is going to take open disrespect to his face. Xi Jinping wouldn't do it, President Donald Trump wouldn't do it, and Vladimir Putin certainly wouldn't do it. So yes, there's a level of decorum and niceties that happen. Also, too, there was that flyover of the B-2 bomber and the 4 F-35s that everyone thought was some kind of military flex on Putin that really made him think twice about messing with the United States. Russians are, generally speaking, in the upper echelons of the Russian government, cynical and pragmatic people who are realists. Cheap tricks like that don't really work on them. I'm sure when Putin saw that, he probably thought to himself, well, gee, that's neat, and then he moved on with his day. I will say, from the perspective of an American, seeing this flying formation is pretty cool to see. It can be pretty awe-inspiring, and if you're leading a country that can't compete with that at all, yeah, sure, it might be intimidating. But the Russian Federation, the leadership of the Russian Federation knows what our Air Force has, and they know its capabilities. And they also have a fifth-generation fighter as well. They have the Su-57, I believe, is what it's called. So did it have Putin shaking in his boots? No, I don't think so. Probably didn't give it a second thought. Was it a cool little thing to see? For like the domestic audience, the American Air Force flexing its power. Sure, I mean, there's always that part of you as a citizen of whatever country you're in. You want to see that country flex its military might. But again, I don't really think it had much of a psychological impact on the Russians. Things like this don't really work on them. They don't care. Also, too, one other thing that came out of this meeting, a very crucial and important thing that I'd like to discuss real quick, is that it appears that the United States government and the Russian Federation's government have come to an understanding on territorial exchanges in the war in Ukraine. It seems that U.S. leadership has resigned itself to the fact that Ukraine is clearly losing this war. It is having a hard time stabilizing the front. Russia still has massive reserves it hasn't used yet, and there's really no way to actually stop the Russian advance. They can slow it down, but they can't completely stop it, not without direct NATO intervention. Now, direct NATO intervention is off the table. It's not going to happen. Everybody knows it. So how do you end this war without starting a war with Russia, but keeping what's left of Ukraine intact? Okay, it's conceding to the fact that the Russians are going to take and hold territory, that if the war drags on longer, the Ukrainians will lose more territory. If this war drags on for another 2 years, then they will likely at that point lose all 4 oblasts in their entirety, and perhaps more, because once Ukraine's military reaches its breaking point, once it's been attrited sufficiently, then at that point the dam breaks. And I think the United States leadership is trying to stop the war before that moment happens, because at that point there's really no turning back, and Ukraine is going to lose whatever it loses. Now that might be difficult for some very pro-Ukrainian people to hear, but it's just the reality on the ground, and I think the U.S. has resigned itself to that fact. So it's finally accepted the fact that Russia is not going to abandon its territorial gains. It's not going to abandon the land bridge that it now has to Crimea, politically, it's not feasible for Russia to do that anyway. It'd be a disaster for Putin's government, a disaster for the Russian government as a whole, if it decided to give up all 4 oblasts and just go home. So it's not going to happen, and I think from a realist perspective, a pragmatic strategist, sometimes you just have to accept things that you may not want to accept, but the reality nonetheless. And I think that's why now President Trump is talking about territorial exchanges, because he knows, okay, the Russian military is obviously still strong enough to keep prosecuting this war to its conclusion. We know that. They don't necessarily want to do that, but how do we end this war in a way that favors Ukraine the best that it can be favored now at this point? So the offer on the table was essentially Russia will stop at the line of contact in Zaporizhia and Kherson in exchange for Ukraine handing over what's left of Donetsk and Luhansk, which I think is less than 30% for Donetsk and less than 5% for Luhansk. And as I mentioned before, I'm guessing the Russians will withdraw from Kharkiv and Sumy completely. That seems to be the offer on the table. And this is where Ukraine sort of shot itself in the foot on this. Where Zelensky specifically shot Ukraine in the foot on this was back in 2022, and I think it's pretty common knowledge now, there was a peace treaty offered, a peace treaty put on the table in Istanbul, Turkey. Essentially, at that point in the war, despite the rhetoric of the Russians, they didn't intend to hold and keep any territory and make it an official part of the Russian Federation. They had actually offered to go home, pull out of Ukraine as long as Ukraine declared their neutrality, declared to not join NATO, as well as follow along with several other Russian demands, but their sovereignty was left generally intact. Their territorial integrity was generally left intact. This deal was rejected by Zelensky, I think, after actually it was not ratified, of course, but signed off on. People forget too, the lead negotiator, Ukrainian negotiator that actually made this deal happen, was killed shortly after, assassinated. The Russians also, from what I understand, and people might argue against this, but the facts I see on the ground seem to indicate that the pullback from Kiev was done in good faith, so that the Ukrainians would accept this deal. Now, after this deal was rejected by the Ukrainians, apparently after it had been generally agreed upon by both parties to implement it, that is when the Russians decided, I think as a punishment to Kiev, to now take the 4 oblasts that they held parts of. And I think the United States government is well aware of that fact. And even General Mark Milley, who a lot of people don't like, myself included, told the Ukrainians bluntly, and this is back in 2022 when Russia was pulling out of the Kharkov Oblast and what the sections that they had over the river in Kherson, because of their troops were stretched too thin and disadvantageous positions, that this is your last chance to negotiate a favorable peace. If you negotiate now, then you might be able to do this. If you allow the Russians to consolidate their lines and gather their strength, at that point you will not win the war. I believe, as incompetent as Milley might have been, he was right here, and the Ukrainians rejected that advice and carried on the war. And I think this is kind of what shot them in the foot. The U.S. government knows that Ukraine had their chance to walk away with most of their territory intact. In exchange, they had to swallow a bit of national pride, but it would have been better for them in the long run. And Zelensky made a very, very foolish strategic choice to continue this war, despite warnings from advisors in the West that doing so would be absolutely foolish. Now, it's assumed that Boris Johnson is the one that actually talked him out of signing this peace treaty and urged him to continue the war, that NATO could supply enough weaponry to defeat Russia. So it would appear that Zelensky rolled the dice, made a large gamble, and lost. And I think that's what really hurt him in these negotiations between the United States and Russia. I think the U.S. is well aware of that, well aware that that was the best deal that Ukraine could have ever gotten at the time, and that because Ukraine is on the losing side of this war, no matter what sentiment might be out there, no matter what people might think is right and wrong in regards to territorial sovereignty, well, the facts are the facts. And once you lose a war, all that goes out the window. This idea of justice and being what's right being done, in regards to the territory you've lost, if you can't physically retake it, and your opponent is strong enough to hold it, and there's no really feasible way to forcefully take it back, either through a collapsing economy or military means, then that territory is gone. And that's just how human history works. And no amount of talking about aggression or territorial sovereignty and integrity or anything like that is going to change that fact. And I think the Trump administration is fully aware that that's where Ukraine stands now, and that its decision to carry on the war far past when it was warned to stop is why it's in the position that it's currently in today. And I'm sure there's plenty of other frustrations with Kiev over quite a few issues, many of them also being financial. So I think the United States is kind of at a point where they know that continuing this war is not in its interest. It's turned into a money pit. It's risking World War III. And it's clear that the Ukrainian army, despite its experience, despite how battle-hardened it is, despite the fact it currently is the best military, I would say, in Europe, just can't win this war. This can't. Their goals cannot be accomplished through strength of arms. So, again, I think that's why now Trump is conceding on territory, and I believe that Putin has also probably taken a very pragmatic view of the situation. If there's a treaty signed where Kiev declares its neutrality, if it pledges to not join NATO, if NATO pulls back from Russia's borders, if it gets what it generally wanted out of this war from the beginning, then I think that they are perfectly willing, despite a lot of Russian hardliners disagreeing, is to give up the remaining claims to what's left of Kherson and Zaporizhia. Okay, well, they've already taken a land bridge, I think, close to the size of Italy. Is it really worth the effort to take the rest of these oblasts when all other objectives were generally met? Because people need to keep in mind one of the original Russian objectives was not territory right off the bat. And I think the idea that this treaty was even floated in Istanbul in 2022, basically giving Ukraine almost all of its territory except for Crimea back, is a testament to that. So I think the Russians are willing to sacrifice some of their territorial ambitions now at this point in the war in favor of getting their strategic ones that they wanted at the very beginning of this war. But what happens from here on out? Will Ukraine concede to these demands? Can Zelensky even politically consider that at this point? I don't think he can. I don't want to go into that in this video, but I think he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's in a situation where he just can't win. And again, this all goes down to rolling the dice and making a huge bet in 2022, a bet that he lost. So it's hard to say what will happen. I think this is the only real outcome in this war that doesn't result in World War III. It's the quickest way to end it. You're saying that from a realistic, pragmatic place. Is it just the country was invaded and had its territory taken from it? On paper, no. We should discourage such actions, but reality is reality, and there's really no way around it. And also, too, the things that caused this war, it's much more complicated than simply just another country wanting territory. There's a lot more factors here, but anyways, I won't get into that in this video, but that's really all I wanted to talk about. There's just a few things from the meeting that I heard people making comments about or raising questions about. But we'll see what happens in the next couple days and weeks in regards to what kind of deal can actually be agreed upon, and if Ukraine would even agree to any kind of deal at all that is reasonable for its country reasonable for a country in its position to actually demand. Again, like, it's making demands as if it's winning the war, but clearly it's not. And if you're on the losing side of anything, really, then at that point, beggars can't be choosers. But anyways, that's all I really wanted to talk about in this video. I will be back Monday with another video, and I'm not really sure what the topic will be yet. We'll just kind of wait and see what happens. But until then, have a good one.